Welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages," and to our 5th episode, The Finest Knight in All the World, The Practical Chivalry of Sir William Marshal, Part 1. William Marshal, who was born around 1147 and died in 1219, was both the flower of chivalry of his day and an important figure in the turbulent world of Plantagenet politics. He served 2 English kings, the young King Henry and his father Henry II, as a household knight, 2 others, Henry II's sons Richard the Lionheart and John, as a baron, ultimately an earl, a royal administrator and advisor, and a 5th, the child King Henry III, as regent and guardian. His remarkable rise was due to the qualities that made him, in the words of both friends and foes, the finest knight in all the world. These qualities were his prowess, his acumen in both war and court politics, and above all, his reputation for unshakeable loyalty. In this episode, we will explore William's life as a landless household knight, what the French medieval historian Georges Duby termed a youth, and what in England was known as a bachelor knight. And William was a bachelor in the modern sense of that word, and a youth in Duby's sense, until he was about 40 years old. In our 2nd episode, we will talk about William's marriage to a wealthy heiress that made him a baron and earl, and William's remarkable career in the service of King John and his infant successor Henry III. In both, our focus is on what made William so successful, his practical chivalry.
In the previous episode, Richard explained that medieval chivalry was an aristocratic ethos that arose in the 11th and 12th centuries to distinguish the self-defined military nobility of medieval Europe from those whom they considered their social inferiors, especially pretentious rich merchants. Although medieval chivalry was an evolving and disputed ethos rather than a code, a consensus had emerged by the late 12th century about the qualities that a knight needed to possess to be deemed a prud'homme, a worthy man. These embodied the virtues of the knight as warrior, skill in combat on horseback, courage, loyal to a lord, with courtliness, that is, the manners and behavior that enhanced a lord's court, and Christian piety, at least piety as interpreted by knight.
All these qualities were important, but the sine qua non was prowess, the ability to fight well with weapons appropriate to a knight, that is, lance and sword. No matter how courteous or pious a knight might be, if he lacked prowess, he could not be a prud'homme, a worthy man.
You just described Monty Python's Black Knight.
Yes, a truly disarming example of prowess and courage.
Oh.
To be fair, a consensus also emerged about the proper use of prowess. A chivalric knight displayed his prowess in service to his earthly lord, in defense of the church, especially by going on crusade, and in the protection of the worthy helpless, that is, noble women in distress and defenseless clergy. Armed clergy, which was not an oxymoron, were another matter.
Of course, that protection was normally from threats from less chivalrous knights.
The church tried to extend this to all non-combatants. That was a bridge too far for the nobility. Prowess became an even more important marker of true chivalry in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, when the urban elites of Italy and Flanders adopted and adapted chivalric manners, and cities began to sponsor jousts that emphasized pageantry rather than actual fighting.
Wealth certainly mattered, but how one acquired it and how one used it were equally important. Honorable wealth came from lordship over land, that is, a noble's manors, and from the exploitation of peasant labor.
I'm sure that nobles would not have characterized their lordship over peasants as exploitation if they even understood the word. They ruled over peasants because that is how God willed it. The Christian world order comprised those who prayed for us, that is, the clergy, those who fought to defend all, the knights and nobles, and those who worked to feed us, everyone else. Rent and labor was a quid pro quo for the protection their lords owed them and the justice they maintained.
Yeah, protection from other nobles, and justice that profited the lord or cost him nothing.
Not all knights had land. Landless knights sought a position in a great noble's household, where each would receive food, clothing, and rewards commensurate with his rank and service, and maybe, ultimately, the gift of a fief.
Serving knights also looked to profit financially from tournaments and especially warfare. Another poem by Bertrand de Born, the appalling troubadour knight you introduced in the last podcast, explained why he and those like him rejoiced at the prospect of war.
Trumpets, drums, standards and pennons, and ensigns and horses white and black we soon shall see, and the world will be good. We'll take the user his money, and never a mule driver will travel the roads in safety, nor a townsman without fear, nor a merchant coming from France. He who gladly takes will be rich. And yes, the music in the background is by Bertrand de Born. Business dealings may have brought wealth, but they didn't bring honor.
How wealth was used also distinguished a chivalric noble from a wealthy merchant. True chivalry required a nobleman to display generosity toward kinsmen, friends, and deserving followers. Wealth was also necessary to display one's nobility through pageantry, the chivalric version of conspicuous consumption.
Above all, medieval chivalry was about honor, which in the Middle Ages meant social status and the respect of other worthy men. Kings and the church attempted to shape this ethos, but ultimately it was the knights themselves who defined it through their practice. Confession time. I chose Ulrich von Liechtenstein as my exemplar of chivalry in the last episode because he is memorably weird, and because some of our listeners might recognize the name from the Heath Ledger movie, The Knight's Tale. Ulrich's Venus tour, in which he rode from Venice to the Czech Republic, dressed in drag as Lady Venus, challenging all good knights to joust against him, was hardly normal behavior even in his own day. It was a theatrical display of Ulrich's prowess as a tournament knight, his wealth, and his generosity, masquerading as courtly service to the lady he professed to love. Ulrich demonstrated his courtliness in a more subtle fashion, by interspersing love songs throughout the service of ladies. Playing musical instruments, singing and writing love poetry and songs were also courtly skills. Although primarily thought of as a warrior, Richard the Lionheart, taken prisoner by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI on his return from crusade, composed a song, Janushon Pri, lamenting the time it was taking for his supporters to raise his ransom. No prisoner can tell his honest thought unless he speaks as one who suffers wrong. But for his comfort he may make a song. My friends are many, but their gifts are naught. Shame will be theirs if for my ransom here I remain for yet another year. The words and music by King Richard the Lionheart. Max Dyer on cello and bass, Martha Gay on harp, and Ray Dillard on percussion. Richard's well-known love of music gave rise to the apocryphal story of how the minstrel Blondel discovered where Richard was imprisoned by traveling from castle to castle in Austria, singing the first verse of a song known only to the two of them. In reality, Richard's whereabouts were well known. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was doing her best to raise his ransom, but it was taking time because of her other son, John's attempts to frustrate her efforts. The reason that Richard was rushing home to England was because Eleanor had sent him word that John, with the aid of King Philip Augustus of France, was attempting to usurp the throne. That much of the Robin Hood story is true.
Maybe Richard the Lionheart should have been your example of chivalry. Ulrich's The Service of Ladies is fun and makes your point about the past being a foreign country, but as I pointed out at the end of our last episode, it's missing several key chivalric virtues. The only time Ulrich demonstrated courage was when he heroically submitted to plastic surgery on his lip. Nowhere in The Service of Ladies do we see Ulrich practicing courtliness in a noble's court or demonstrating any Christian piety. Even his willingness to go on crusade is about his service to the ladies rather than to God, as the squire pointed out. And because Ulrich took on the persona of a knight-errant out of a romance, the only loyalty he demonstrates is to his lady, not a king or a lord. Even his prowess seems frivolous.
In a sense, Ulrich seems to have had too much money and too little to do. The general peacefulness of southern Germany in the early 13th century shaped how he exhibited his chivalry.
Fortunately for our purposes, there was a knight from the generation before Ulrich who exhibited all of the qualities missing from The Service of Ladies, Sir William Marshal.
Elle, why don't you tell our listeners who Sir William Marshal was?
Oh, with pleasure. He was an English knight and baron of the late 12th and early 13th century, and one of my very favorite characters in medieval history. Praised as the finest knight of his day by contemporaries, William's life reads like a medieval story. Starting out as a landless squire whose only possession was family connections, William rose from household knight to become one of the wealthiest, most powerful nobles in early 13th century England. In his last years, he served as regent for the boy king Henry III, leading the royal forces against a French invasion invited by a baronial revolt. This may not be a rags to riches story, as William began at the bottom of the highest stratum of society, but this is as close as it gets for medieval knights. William's remarkable rise was a consequence of the qualities that made him an exemplar of late 12th century chivalry: prowess in tournaments and combat, tactical and strategic acumen in war, the courtesy and discretion necessary to navigate the shoals of the royal court, and above all, a reputation for unwavering loyalty to those he served. This was not the chivalry of Sir Walter Scott or even Ulrich von Liechtenstein. It was an intensely practical chivalry. William Marshal's life is a window on the politics and aristocratic culture of Plantagenet England, and provides the best insight into what chivalry meant in practice in England and France in the late 12th and early 13th century.
We know more about William Marshal than any other English knight of the Middle Ages because of an extraordinary and unique primary source, l'Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, the history of William the Marshal. This long biographical poem, 19,000 lines of verse, 5 times as long as the Song of Roland, was composed by John the Troubadour for Marshal's eldest son, Earl William Marshal II. The guiding force behind the work was another John, John of Early, William Marshal's closest friend and squire. The author's intention, of course, was to glorify William Marshal and to present him as the flower of chivalry. The history presents William Marshal as the epitome of the prud'homme, a worthy man. For the poet, this meant a nobly born man of prowess, unshakable loyalty, and piety, who possessed the complementary skills and temperament of a courtier. The reader of the poem needs to remember that this is a literary work rather than a historical study. But John was writing for an audience who had known the Marshal, and his goal was to write a biography that would ring true to them. What the author of the history knew of William Marshal's childhood and youth was stories that the elderly Marshal enjoyed telling his household knights. If these were intended for their edification, the lessons he taught are not what a modern audience might think appropriate for the education of a chivalric knight.
The history is full of wonderful anecdotes that tell us a lot about the values and mentality of knights and barons in the early 13th century.
Those wonderful anecdotes got you into trouble in a class on medieval England that you took with the professor who was later to become my dissertation advisor, J.M.W. Bean, Malcolm Bean.
Oh, yes. I was happily telling a story from the childhood of William Marshal in class when Professor Bean interrupted me to say, "Miss Harrison, I trust you realize that you have mocked that to which I have dedicated my life." Well, I hadn't mocked anything. I loved this stuff. Unfortunately, as my own undergraduate advisor, Professor Suzanne Vempel, once said of me, Ellen could have the makings of an historian if only she could overcome her affinity for the anecdotal mode.
Fortunately, the anecdotal mode is perfect for a podcast. So why don't you tell our listeners about William Marshal's first close brush with death as a child of about 5. But first, let me set the historical stage. William Marshal was the 4th son of John Fitzgilbert, a landowner with manors in Wiltshire in southwestern England. John Fitzgilbert held the hereditary office of Marshal in the royal households of King Henry I of England, King Stephen, and Queen Matilda. A royal marshal was responsible for the king's stables, made travel arrangements for a royal court that was always on the move, and led the king's household knights in time of war.
William himself did not assume the office until the death of an older brother, but before then Marshal seems to have become a family surname.
The long and brutal civil war that followed King Henry I's death, pitting his nephew King Stephen against King Henry's daughter, the Empress Matilda, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, put barons like John Fitzgilbert into impossible conflicts of loyalty. In the absence of effective central authority, it also gave them an opportunity to increase their holdings by seizing lands from their neighbors, building castles without royal approval, and switching allegiances when they thought it would be to their benefit. John Marshal did all of that. John Marshal was guided by a determination to protect and expand his holdings. William Marshal's mother, Sybil, was John Marshal's second wife, and of higher rank than her husband. The marriage was a political alliance that ended a local private war between her brother, Earl Patrick of Salisbury, and John Marshal. The only problem was that John Marshal at the time was married with 2 sons. But he was not a romantic. The choice between having Earl Patrick as an ally or keeping his first wife was an easy one.
The choice between his youngest son and a castle was also not difficult for John Marshal. John Marshal was not a sentimental man. William's earliest memory was his father giving him to King Stephen as a hostage to obtain a truce during a siege. King Stephen had no reason to trust John Marshal, who had been a member of his court before he switched his loyalty to the Empress Matilda. Ostensibly, the truce was so John Marshal could consult Matilda about surrendering the castle. Instead, John used the time to stock supplies and strengthen the garrison. When messengers from Stephen threatened to kill the 5-year-old boy, John coolly replied, "Do with him what you will. I have the anvil and the hammer yet to forge better sons." Now, a king like Henry I wouldn't have thought twice about fulfilling the threat. When an outraged noble demanded justice for the blinding of his son while held hostage by Henry's son-in-law Eustace, the king gave him permission to blind his 2 hostages, who happened to be the king's own granddaughters. But Stephen, unlike his sociopathic contemporaries, couldn't bring himself to give the order. He had grown fond of the child, who saw the whole thing as a game and his captors as playmates.
When William was about 13, his father sent him to be trained for knighthood in the household of his cousin, William, Lord of Tankerville, the hereditary constable of Normandy. William served him as a squire, and at the age of 20 was dubbed a knight. The affair was simple. The constable girded a sword around William's waist and probably struck him on his 2 shoulders, and voila! William Marshal was now a knight. The knighting took place while the constable was preparing to defend the town of Drincourt against the Count of Flanders. William fought enthusiastically and well until he was wounded by a group of Flemish mercenaries who sunk an iron hook into his shoulder in an attempt to pull him to the ground. He escaped, but his horse died from its wounds. At the feast that followed the victory, one of the nobles teasingly asked William for the gift of a horse harness, and when William said he had none to give, the noble, in mock surprise, said, "How odd! I thought you must have had 40 or even 60 today." Everyone laughed. The point of the joke was serious. A knight, especially a landless knight, had to look out for himself. Rather than capture knights for ransom, William had fought simply to protect the town, and that was something that he could not afford to do. Soon after his knighting, William returned to England to join the household of his most prominent relative, his uncle, Earl Patrick. Henry II, son of the Empress Matilda and Count Geoffrey of Anjou, now ruled England, and along with it about a third of France. From his mother, Henry II inherited the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy. From his father, the County of Anjou, and when he married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, soon after the annulment of her 15-year marriage to King Louis VII of France, he added the large, prosperous, and completely ungovernable County of Poitou and Duchy of Aquitaine to what historians term the Angevin Empire. Angevin is the French adjectival form of Anjou.
Patrick was assigned to aid Eleanor in bringing Poitou under a semblance of control. The Lusignan brothers, Geoffrey and Guy, ambushed Earl Patrick as he was escorting Eleanor. Eleanor managed to escape, but an unarmed Earl Patrick was struck down from behind. Enraged, the young William Marshal charged alone against the murderers. His horse was killed underneath him. Surrounded, he backed up against a hedgerow, and, in the words of the poet, quote, "fought like a wild boar amongst the dogs," close quote, until a knight got behind the hedgerow and slashed his thigh. The wounded marshal was taken prisoner. Surprising everyone, Queen Eleanor paid the ransom. Eleanor was so impressed with Marshal's loyalty to his uncle, his courage, and his prowess, that she convinced her husband to appoint William as tutor-in-arms to their oldest son, Henry, known as the young king. Young Henry was 15 years old, and his father had recently had the boy crowned and anointed king. Henry II gave the boy the title of king, but no land to rule. In lieu of actual responsibilities, young Henry, who was reportedly charming, generous, and courtly, devoted himself to chivalry. He became a tournament addict, and William became his champion team captain. In the movie, one would expect to see William charge his opponents in a tournament, with lance lowered and unhorse them, and then perhaps fight on foot with swords until they surrendered. But William's signature move was more elegant and less violent. He would ride past an opponent and at the last minute snatch the reins from his hands. William would then lead horse and rider off the tournament grounds. The only answer to this move was to cut the reins or leap off the horse. Either action left a knight helpless and vulnerable to capture. William's success in tournaments gained him renown, raised him in the esteem of the young king, and brought him wealth from the ransoms paid by the knights he captured. This usually consisted of their war horse, horse gear, and armor, which the merchants who frequented tournaments would buy and resell for profit. William's ransoms were known to be reasonable, which made the knights he captured more resigned to their fate. On his deathbed, William estimated that he had taken at least 500 knights over his lifetime. This was not boasting. In a 10-month period in the late 1170s, he and a fellow knight with whom he formed a partnership captured 103 knights. We know this because they persuaded the young king's kitchen clerk to keep a tally of their captures. Now, tournament earnings meant nothing to barons who participated in them, but they were everything to landless household knights like William Marshal.
Modern historians rank Henry II among the very best kings of England. He restored peace and central authority after a destructive and chaotic civil war and established the rule of law. Along with his grandfather Henry I, Henry II is credited with creating the common law, that is, the law to which all free Englishmen could appeal. In the medieval period, common law was the king's law. In a series of assizes, meetings of the king and the magnates of the realm, Henry II established the superiority of the king's law and courts over those of his barons, and developed regular legal procedures to resolve disputes over lands held from the crown, made urgent by the tangled claims created by the Civil War. But contemporaries had little admiration for Henry II, whom they saw as ungenerous and legalistic. They much preferred his chivalrous son, the young King Henry. For Bertrand de Born, young Henry was, quote, the best king who ever took up a shield, the most daring and best of all tourneyers. From the time when Roland was alive and even before, never was seen a knight so skilled, so warlike, whose fame resounded so around the world.
William Marshal liked to tell his household knights about his own experiences when he was in their position. Unsurprisingly, he emphasized his prowess and his loyalty. But even the most loyal knight could be falsely accused by envious peers, and this is what happened to William when he was master of arms in the household of the young king. William was not only the captain of young Henry's team of knights, but he was by far the best knight in any tournament. Calling him the finest knight who ever was or ever will be, the young king preferred to be knighted by William Marshal than even the King of France, an unheard of honor for someone of Marshal's rank. Young Henry further honored William by elevating him to the status of knight banneret, a knight who could unfurl his own banner and captain his own squadron of knights in a tournament.
Noble courts were often rife with tensions. They were filled with young knights vying to be noticed by the lord, his lady, or the seneschal, upon whose favor their welfare depended. Given the youth of the household knights, their warrior identities, the fact that they were usually armed with swords, and the culture's emphasis on honor, this competition could erupt in violence, which perhaps explains why the heroes of medieval romances were always courteous to their fellow knights, and when praised, always respond with modesty, downplaying the deeds they have performed. This courtly quality was known as mesure, self-restraint, the ability to shake off an insult and respect the peace of the Lord's court. Worth was demonstrated through actions not claimed by words. The history makes a point of presenting William as self-deprecating, easygoing, and good-natured. When I taught this to midshipmen, I compared this quality of restraint and calculated self-deprecation to the star college quarterback who, having had a spectacular day on the field, tells the interviewer that his great receivers and selfless blockers are the true heroes of the game. And of course, he thanks God.
The favor shown to William by the young king aroused the envy of his fellow household knights, some of whom stood well above Marshal in the social pecking order. Jealous of William's success and fearing to challenge him directly, they started a whispering campaign, accusing him of placing the young king at risk in tournaments while he pursued ransoms. Far more seriously, they spread the rumor that William was sleeping with the young king's wife, Margaret, daughter of King Louis VII of France. Now, the young king did not want to confront William directly, but the rumors made it impossible for William to continue in his service. Now, although romances about Lancelot and Tristram may have made adultery with the queen seem glamorous, in real life, adultery was deadly serious. It shamed the cuckolded husband, and worse, threatened the legitimacy of his bloodline. Now, the culture approved of knights praising the beauty of his lord's wife, but this was a game played in the presence of the lord and was meant to flatter him as much as the lady. To go beyond that was both a personal betrayal and, in the case of the wives of kings and counts, treason. A household knight bold enough to emulate Lancelot or Tristan risked death if discovered. It is very unlikely that William actually betrayed young Henry in this fashion, but the rumor itself was enough to tarnish the young king's honor as well as William's. William demanded the right to clear his name through trial by combat against his accusers, but his reputation was such that no knight was willing to step forward and accept the challenge.
William Marshal suddenly found himself as a knight-errant. Knights-errant wandering the countryside in search of adventure were a staple of medieval romances, but they are almost always the sons of kings or princes. Once again, reality and romance diverged. For William, what it meant was that he was a landless knight without a lord to serve. Fortunately for William, his reputation made him a desirable commodity to other great nobles who sponsored tournament teams, and several counts, including Philip of Flanders, bid against one another for the privilege to be his patron.
Then suddenly young Henry recalled William to service. The young king's frustration and resentment against his father and his younger brothers Geoffrey and Richard had erupted in an unsuccessful rebellion a decade earlier, which Henry II had forgiven. Now the young king was threatening a second rebellion. His need for an experienced fighter and tactician trumped the unproven rumors, which were undermined anyway by the defection of the chief accuser. William Marshal, always solicitous about his reputation for loyalty, asked Henry II's permission to rejoin his son's household. He even had King Philip Augustus write on his behalf, emphasizing William's character and prudence. Henry II, hoping that Marshal would talk sense to young Henry and head off the war, acceded in the request.
This brings us to my favorite anecdote about Marshal. On his way to rendezvous near Paris with two friends who were also rushing to support the young king, William encountered a runaway monk and a noble lady in the forest. William, who was napping by the side of the road, was awakened by the sound of horses riding by. Without first arming himself, the curious William decided to chase after them to find out who they were and what their business is. When he caught up with them, William grabbed hold of the man's heavy cloak and demanded to know who he was. The man, noticing that William was unarmed, pulled himself free and responded that he should mind his own business. When the man placed his hand on his sword, William told him that he was game for a fight and called on his squire to hand him his sword. John the Troubadour describes what happened next. The man took fright and drew back. The marshal dug in his spears and seized the man by his hood. He tugged at it so violently that the man's hood came off, exposing him to be the most handsome monk to be found between there and Cologne. The lady revealed herself to be the sister of a knight from Flanders whom William knew quite well. "My fair lady," William lectured her, "you are not behaving sensibly. I advise you in good faith to desist from this folly, and I shall reconcile you with your brother." The lady, fearful of being shamed, refused to return to her kinsman. The marshal then turned to the monk and demanded to know how he planned to support himself and the lady. The monk showed him a heavy purse containing 48 pounds. Although this was a large sum of money, William asked how the monk intended to live off of that money. The monk responded, "We shall advance them to others to make a profit and live on the interest." The marshal replied, "What, usury? God's lance! I don't care much for this." He then ordered his squire to take the money from them in order to prevent the monk from committing the sin of usury. He sent them on their way with a lecture. Upon meeting up with his companions at an inn, William told them the story and generously shared the loot with them. They urged him to catch up with the eloping couple and take their horses and baggage as well, but William decided he had done enough.
Sidney Painter, whose biography of Marshal represents him as a paragon of chivalric virtue, felt it necessary to justify his hero's actions here. In taking the couple's money, Painter explained, William was acting as a sort of Christian police officer intervening against sin. To most of us, including me, I suspect that what William did looks more like a mugging. Clergy of the time might have thought so as well. According to canon law, William ought to have taken both the monk and the money to the nearest archdeacon. That William chose not to do so and was so proud of his decision that he turned it into a story to amuse and edify his household knights decades later is revealing of the mindset of his class.
The story probably amused Marshal's friends and household knights. The mugged couple, in particular the uppity cleric, deserved their fate for their shameful behavior, and William and his companion knights deserved to profit from it. Whatever we or a 12th century cleric might think of his actions, the marshal himself had no doubt that what he had done was to his credit as well as to his profit. The story of William Marshal's encounter with the runaway couple challenges modern conceptions of chivalry, but it is consistent with how Marshal and his contemporaries understood that ethos.
The young king's rebellion came to a sudden end when young Henry contracted dysentery. As he lay dying, he saw the cross stitched on his cloak and remembered his unfulfilled vow to go on crusade. Young Henry turned to William and asked him, as his intimate friend, to take his cloak to Jerusalem to fulfill his vow. So William went on crusade. The only thing we know for certain about it is that while in the Holy Land, William pledged that before he died he would join the Order of the Knights Templar, the now notorious monastic military order founded to protect Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem.
Upon his return in 1186, William Marshal entered the service of Henry II. King Henry had had reservations about William's influence on his prodigal son. That was now replaced by respect and admiration for William's loyalty. He took the measure of the Marshal and saw him to be a valuable asset. He endowed William with his first fief, the large estate of Cartmel in the north of England, and named him as the guardian of a royal ward, Heloise of Lancaster. By marrying Heloise, as was his right, William would have become a baron on the order of his father. William remained a loyal household knight, but he was no longer landless. Henry II appreciated William's military abilities, and he now needed all the military support he could get. Henry was at war against the King of France, Philip Augustus, and simultaneously faced a rebellion by his eldest remaining son, Richard the Lionheart, who, in order to secure his hold on Aquitaine against his father, had done homage to Philip for the duchy. In the service of King Henry II, William Marshal had the opportunity to display another chivalric quality, strategic acumen. Probably most people think of battles like Agincourt when they think of medieval warfare. In reality, battles were rare in the 11th through 14th centuries. Warfare was much more like Sherman's march to the sea than Gettysburg. The primary military activities were ravaging and sieges. This did not provide knights with much of an opportunity to display prowess other than in skirmishes, and that helps to explain the popularity of tournaments. Occasionally, sieges would be temporarily suspended to allow the opposing knights to joust against one another, not as a trial by combat to determine the outcome of the siege, but simply to demonstrate prowess and pass the time. King Philip Augustus's invasion of Normandy in 1188 was a typical campaign. Philip's troops ravaged the countryside, besieged the key castle of Gisors, and when he failed to take it, withdrew his forces. Henry II, asked William Marshal for advice on how to respond. "Listen to me, sire," William said. "Philip has divided and disbanded his troops. I advise you to disperse your men also, but to give them secret orders to reassemble at a given time and place. From there they are to ride into the territory of the King of France and ravage it. If this is done in force prudently and promptly, then the King of France will find that he has suffered great damage." "By God's eyes," said the king, "Marshal, you are most courteous, and have given me good advice. I shall do exactly as you suggest." And he did, with success. This was standard operating procedure in French and English warfare in the late 12th century. What is striking is that the advice that William gave to Henry II is described as most courteous. What William was recommending involved laying waste fields, villages, and towns, all the while plundering and killing cattle and non-combatants. As the poet observed, such raids were effective because when the poor can no longer reap a harvest from their fields, then they can no longer pay their rents, and this in turn impoverishes their lords. Chivalric restraint and mercy did not extend below the knightly class. Clerics actively disapproved of this destructive form of warfare, just as they disapproved of tournaments. In both cases, their condemnations fell upon deaf ears. For soldiers such as William Marshal, there was nothing shameful or dishonorable in waging war that targeted peasants and townsmen. Even for the flower of late 12th century chivalry, warfare was waged more through fire than the sword.
If ambushes, deception, and raids designed to ravage the countryside, destroying the enemy's economic resources, were all accepted military activities, what, if anything, was considered unchivalric by the poet and his audience?
For the poet, it came down to killing an unarmed knight, as the Lusignan brothers had done to Earl Patrick, or abandoning a town that one is obliged to defend. Otherwise, all was fair, including killing the horse under the knight.
You are alluding to the story about how William Marshal ambushed Richard the Lionheart, then Count of Poitou, to stop his pursuit of the dying Henry II.
In the last 2 years of his reign, Henry II fought a losing war against his elder surviving son and presumed heir, Richard, and his longtime rival and nominal overlord, King Philip Augustus of France. The root of Richard's rebellion was once again sibling rivalry. A rumor had spread, perhaps started by King Philip and certainly encouraged by him, that Henry intended to disinherit Richard in favor of his beloved youngest son John. Henry II, always coy about the succession, did nothing to squash the rumor, which Richard took as confirmation. Richard, who had been fighting alongside his father in a territorial war against Philip Augustus, now joined forces with the French king with the common goal of deposing Henry. Henry was seriously ill, but that mattered little to Richard.
And the old king's support dwindled as knowledge of his poor health spread. Henry II took refuge in the city of Le Mans. As Philip's forces closed on the city, Henry and what remained of his forces fled. William Marshal remained behind with a small force to cover the retreat. Richard, so eager to capture his father that he hadn't bothered to put on armor, led the pursuit. William ordered his men to hide near the road and wait. When Richard appeared, William sprang the ambush and charged Richard with his lance lowered. Taken by surprise, Richard cried out, "God's legs, Marshal, don't kill me. It wouldn't be right. I'm unarmed." William responded, "I won't kill you. I'll leave that to the devil," and drove his lance into Richard's horse. Richard fell hard to the ground. "It is my belief," commented the troubadour, quote, "that no single lance blow achieves such a rescue, saving men doomed to loss, pain, and woe, since God in his passion allowed himself to be stricken with a lance." Close quote.
Everyone knew that Henry had lost his war against his son, and that Richard inevitably would succeed to the throne. There was no upside in supporting the ailing Henry II, and nobles began either to defect or to return to their homes. Appreciating William's steadfast loyalty and increasingly dependent on him, Henry II rewarded William by allowing him to exchange his guardianship of Heloise for that of a far more desirable heiress, Isabel de Clare, the daughter of Earl Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, the Earl of Tregoil and Pembroke in Wales, and Conqueror of Leinster in Ireland. Of course, William's marriage to Isabel depended upon Henry II's survival. Henry died at the castle of Chinon, attended only by lowly servants, who took advantage of the situation by stripping the corpse of anything of value, including the king's clothing. By the time that William and his fellow household knights learned of the death of their lord and returned to Chinon, they found his naked corpse lying on the ground. William remained with the body to fulfill the final melancholy duty of a man to his lord, to assure him a decent burial. Once again William had served the Lord faithfully to the end, and once again William found himself on the losing side. There was no money for alms to the poor as customary upon the death of a king. William Marshal prepared to sell his horse to pay for the funeral. He didn't have to. The barons of Anjou and Touraine came to escort the king's body to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a mixed religious house favored by both Henry and Eleanor, where he was to be buried. The corpse lay there awaiting the arrival of Count Richard, soon to be King Richard. As did William Marshal. Days before, William had been a man on the cusp of ascending through marriage into the highest stratum of his society. Now he was simply the lord of the manor of Cartmel. His future lay in the hands of the man whose horse he had killed under him.